What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And today, we're going to be diving into the case of a little boy who seemingly vanished into the night from his family's home in the quiet town of Dickson, Tennessee. Now, this story is layered, it's heartbreaking, it's confusing, and most of all, it is infuriating. There's a lot of people with the exact same name. There's different stories, and they change all the time. It's a lot of information, so hang on in there. This is going to be a very intricate case, and you're going to have to pay attention from start to finish. Today, we are talking about the case of 5-year-old Joe Clyde Daniels. He was reported missing just before sunrise on April 4th, 2018, and his father ended up telling authorities that baby Joe, who was autistic and nonverbal, had somehow slipped out of the house in the middle of the night and disappeared, which in and of itself isn't strange. Elopement is something that does tend to occur a lot of the time in people that are diagnosed with autism. But unfortunately, this case took a very different turn. Law enforcement responded almost immediately. But unfortunately, as hours passed and then that first day turned into night, something just felt off. The deeper that investigators looked, the more the story wasn't making sense. So let's go ahead and dive right into the details. So obviously, before we get deeper into what happened, it's really important to talk about who Joe Clyde Daniels really was. Because as I remind you guys in almost every video, he's not just a headline or a name on a flyer. He was a 5-year-old little boy. He was a son and a brother and a very well-loved student. Now, Joe Clyde, who went by Baby Joe or Little Joe to everyone, was born on February 15th, 2013 to Crystal and Joseph Daniels. He was 5 years old at the time that he disappeared, and he had blonde hair and a bright smile and a ton of energy. He was diagnosed with autism pretty early on. He was nonverbal, which meant that he couldn't communicate with words, but that didn't mean that baby Joe didn't express himself. He used lots of different gestures and emotion and movement and direct eye contact, and he just really had this spark about him that you had to kind of be patient to see. He was a student at Centennial Elementary School in Dickson, where he was in a classroom that gave him all of the structure and attention that he needed. And it seems like his teachers absolutely adored him. He was working so hard at the time to learn the alphabet, and he was in fact improving in his communication skills. There's videos that have been played at the trial where you hear him trying to learn how to say his ABCs and say numbers. He always showed up to school and wanted to do his best, but obviously he also faced a lot of challenges. Joe had pretty significant motor delays. He was actually in the first percentile for his age. So even things like holding a pencil or buttoning a shirt were very difficult for him, if he could even do them at all. But still, he showed up every single day and he tried his best. He loved snack time. That was his favorite. And specifically, he always wanted to have an apple. He was also very particular about what he wore every day. And so usually you could see Joe showing up to school wearing cowboy boots, a plaid button-down shirt, and he loved a pair of jeans. But there were a lot of things that he didn't like as well. He hated loud noises. Storms in particular, like thunderstorms, would usually leave him completely overwhelmed because for Joe, the world could be a pretty scary place, and the people around him were supposed to help be his safety net, especially when he was so little. Now, at home, Joe lived with 7 other people. He had his parents, Crystal and Joseph Daniels. He had his 3-year-old brother, Noah, and his 8-year-old half-brother named Alex. There was also his great-aunt, Joyce Austin, and his grandparents, Big Joe and Belle Daniels. So we've got 3 Joes here. We've got baby Joe, his dad, whose name was also Joe or Joseph, and then granddaddy Joseph. And they all lived together under one roof. That is 8 people in a small home. Now, Joseph, his dad, had recently quit his job, and Crystal was a stay-at-home mom, and so at the time, the only steady income was really coming from Big Joe. That's just what I'm referring him to. I have no idea if that's what everyone else called him. That's just kind of what I've used to keep everybody separated. But he worked as a long-haul truck driver, and he often parked his rig in the yard when he was at home. And he had a particularly close relationship with Baby Joe. Baby Joe loved his truck. He hated when he had to go on trips, though. Since he was a long-haul truck driver, he was typically going states away. He was gone for whole weekends, sometimes a week at a time. And so it seemed like Big Joe was kind of really his one person that he clung to in the home, other than Alex, his bigger brother. Now, with so many adults in the house, 5 to be exact, you would hope that Joe had tons of care and attention, but unfortunately, that just didn't turn out to be the case. His needs required a lot of extra time and patience, and in an environment like that, unfortunately, patience can sometimes run thin. And so, unfortunately, Joe's vulnerability, his inability to speak or explain what was happening, would soon become the very thing that made him such an easy target. And this leads us to the day that baby Joe vanished from his home. Now, on the morning of April 4th, 2018, at exactly 6:26 a.m., a 911 call came in to the Dickson dispatch. And it was Joseph Daniels, and he proceeded to tell the dispatch that 5-year-old baby Joe had disappeared during the night. And it was his wording that I think right away kind of set off a few red flags. That and his nonchalant attitude during the 911 call, because he very specifically stated, not "my son ran away, I'm so concerned." He used the word escape. And that's been a pretty controversial subject in this case in particular, because those who deal with children that struggle with elopement, escape literally is the word. You are keeping them in to protect them. They're not escaping you because you're the problem. They're escaping their safety. They're escaping the area where they're being kept so that they cannot get hurt. But regardless, he said, "My son has escaped," and so law enforcement was at the property in less than 10 minutes. Now, when officers arrived at the Daniels home, Joseph immediately explained that baby Joe had actually been sleeping in the master bedroom that night with his older brother, Alex. And that typically wasn't something that they did, but because Big Joe, the grandfather, and Belle, the grandmother, had been off on a long-distance truck route to Texas, they were out of town, and so Joe and Alex decided they were going to sleep in that room. And so the two of them were in there. Joseph and Crystal, baby Joe's parents, were in their own room, and the youngest son, Noah, was actually sleeping with Aunt Joyce because there had been really, really bad storms the night before, and he was scared. He wanted someone to be with, and so I guess Aunt Joyce is who he chose. Now, Joseph told authorities that he went to bed the night before at about 10 p.m., and he went to wake baby Joe up at around 5:20 to get him ready for school. He said he had already picked out baby Joe's clothes, he had neatly placed them on the coffee table, but when he walked into the master bedroom, Alex was there, and baby Joe was gone. And so he immediately woke up Crystal and everyone else in the house, and they searched everywhere to try to find him. They were searching all through the home itself. They were searching on the property, and when they couldn't find him after an hour, they finally decided it was time to call the police. Now, Joseph claimed that baby Joe had run off before, but he said that it only ever happened during the day. And on top of that, even when baby Joe would run from the home, he never went far. He loved to go and wander in the backyard, but he never went in the woods. They lived in a very rural area. He never traveled far from the home, and so typically he was found quickly and everything was okay. But this early morning was clearly very, very different. And not just that, Joseph's story that he was able to give authorities after this was incredibly detailed, because from the very beginning, it seemed like he already had a pretty specific theory on what happened. And I'm not talking just like a general guess or uncertainty. It was like a step-by-step breakdown of the events that he believed happened, that he had figured out all on his own, even before law enforcement had time to process any of the scene. So Joseph began to tell authorities that baby Joe must have somehow gotten up in the middle of the night. He said in order for baby Joe to have gotten out, he would have had to push the coffee table in the living room across the living room in order to reach a key that was hidden on the mantle above the fireplace. That key would then have to have been used to unlock a padlock installed high up on the back door, which means that then baby Joe would have had to move the table over to the door, unlocked that lock high up, taken the lock off of the door, and then, according to Joseph, baby Joe must have then taken the padlock and thrown it in the toy bin, because that's where he found it when he was trying to look for baby Joe. However, he said that baby Joe would have also had to have put that key back on that spot on the mantle, because the key was still there when he checked for it. And after all of this, baby Joe pushed the table back over to the living room and then slipped out into the night without anyone noticing. Now, the front door to the house was actually blocked by a really large piece of furniture. That front door hadn't been used in at least months. And so the family relied exclusively on this back door that he was claiming baby Joe went out of for coming in and out of the house. And the reason it had this padlock so high up on the door, out of Joe's reach, and the key was hidden and all of these things, was specifically to keep baby Joe from wandering off. Now, if that sounds like a lot for just a 5-year-old to do in silence in general, you wouldn't be wrong. But it is especially a lot for one with severe motor delays. Joe could not pull pegs out of a board. He couldn't tie his shoes. He couldn't fasten buttons. Keep in mind, he was in the first percentile for all forms of motor skills. It would have taken him a considerable effort, and he would have been doing things that he had never been able to do in his whole life to get all of that done, and it probably would not have been very quiet. But no one in the house claimed to have heard him leave. But with that being said, baby Joe was sleeping on the opposite side of the house from everyone else. So to give you an idea of the layout of this home, first of all, it was not an open concept. There were walls and hallways that separated each room. And so the master bedroom was on one side, and there were 2 double doors that opened up to the living room. And that's where both the front and back exterior door were located, which is where baby Joe got out. From there, you go into the dining room and the kitchen, and then eventually a hallway. And off of that hallway are all the other rooms where everyone else was sleeping. So they were on opposite sides of the house. And that does make it plausible that no one would have heard anything. But still, the logistics of everything sounded a little odd to authorities. Even more so because, as I mentioned, there had been storms the night before. That's why baby Joe's little brother decided to sleep with their great aunt that night. The ground was soaked. And according to Joseph, baby Joe left barefoot because apparently all of his shoes were accounted for, and a pair of skeleton pajamas. And he had a known fear of thunder. Why would baby Joe have run from the home during his most feared weather event? Like, it was the one thing that always shut him down. Law enforcement at this point couldn't dismiss the possibility that baby Joe did run off, because if there was even a chance that this had happened, they knew that they had to act fast. Now, inside the house, things also looked a little bit too tidy. There were no signs of a frantic search for a 5-year-old. Officers did notice that baby Joe's school clothes were laid out on the coffee table, which lined up with what Joseph had said. But the whole scene really was painting a picture of a normal routine, something that wasn't matching the chaos that comes with looking for a missing child, like a whole family looking for a missing child for an hour. Authorities decided to immediately search every single corner of the home just to ensure that baby Joe wasn't hiding somewhere. They searched the outbuildings and every single closet. They also ended up finding a truck that was parked out back that was filled with tons of trash bags, and they dumped every single one of them out, went through all of the insides to make sure there was no sign of baby Joe. But after searching the entire house and majority of the property as thoroughly as they could in that moment, there was still no sign of him. So by 8 a.m., helicopters were in the sky, and Sergeant Daniel Baker, one of the very first on the scene, was already in the air with that helicopter assisting with the aerial search. At this point, they felt like they needed a bird's eye view. There was a lot of open farmland and wooded areas, ravines, and they wanted to be able to assist with ground teams to spot anything unusual in the fields, tree lines, or bodies of water. They knew that they needed to cover as much space visually as they could because there's no telling how far baby Joe could have gotten. Searchers were also on the ground. There were canine units that used baby Joe's clothing to track his scent, and they actually did get what seemed like a few hits. Now, one dog managed to track Joe's scent from the backyard, so right out that back door where he would have left, along the back tree line of the property to a nearby vacant house. And so because, again, maybe he didn't wander far, but maybe he got lost or scared, possibly went into this house to hide, they decided to search the entire house right away. But there was still no sign of baby Joe there. And so then the dog tracked from the house to a nearby pond, where it unfortunately lost the scent. And I am sure seeing the scent go cold of a little 5-year-old boy at the edge of a pond is horrifying. And so a second dog was brought out, and this dog ended up picking up the same trail but didn't end up losing the scent at the pond, and instead continued south along McElhaney Road, which, from what I'm remembering looking at Google Maps, runs parallel to Garner's Creek Road where the family lived. And so it would make sense if he left out the back door and kept on walking straight, he eventually would have ended up on this road. And so that first dog was redeployed, and this dog followed that same trail down McElhaney Road for miles before eventually tiring out. And so they didn't even stop the dog search because they lost the scent this time. The dog got too tired to continue on. And so everyone began to wonder, how on earth did this little 5-year-old boy get this far barefoot in pajamas in the dark? Like, even our dogs that are highly trained and athletic are exhausted. This is so incredibly bizarre. Now, at one point during the searches, they even ended up finding the footprint of a small child, and a dog was brought out to this location as well, and this also ended up leading to another pond. So they decided to drain this whole pond, but unfortunately nothing more was found. Cadaver dogs were also called in, and they were sniffing for any trace of human remains around the property and beyond. Maybe someone took advantage of a situation. Maybe he didn't just leave the house on his own, since it didn't sound like him, and someone came and lured him out. I mean, they were trying to keep every possibility open at this point to find baby Joe as fast as they possibly could. They also decided to send dive teams to methodically search every nearby pond, nearby creeks, and drainage ditches. The Dickson County Sheriff's Office even decided to coordinate the draining of the family's septic tank. I guess they ended up finding the septic tank in the front yard, and there was like a perfectly sized hole that could have fit a 5-year-old. And so they worried, since they couldn't get in there to look themselves, maybe he got in there and they would need to pump it, drain it to check and see if that's what happened. But nothing ended up being found. And the family also had their own suggestions. Baby Joe absolutely loved his grandfather, and since he was a long-distance truck driver and out of town, they believed it was possible that maybe baby Joe tried to go and look for him. And the one place he would know to look was a nearby Love's truck stop where his grandfather frequently went. And so they wondered, maybe he wandered off to go in that direction, but no one could seem to say if they believed he actually would be able to make it there or not. We're talking 9 miles away. Like, would he even know the direction to go in? Or did he just go out and wander aimlessly, thinking that's where he was going to end up? By noon that day, the TBI also brought in their own airplane, and this one was equipped with infrared. The Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, also known as TEMA, was also there. The Tennessee Highway Patrol, I mean, countless volunteers and organizations from across the region were there already. Within a matter of hours, they had hundreds of searchers on ATV, on horses, helicopters, drones, boats, divers, dogs. They had already started looking into sex offenders, checking local properties for signs that a body had been buried. This was one of the largest missing child searches in Tennessee history to this point, surpassing some of even the most high-profile abduction cases in scale and resources, but yet they still were finding no sign that this little boy had run away, and they couldn't figure out why. I mean, not a single thing was pointing them in any sort of solid direction, and they felt like with this much going into the search, there would at least be clues at this point. And to top it off, in those first few hours, something just wasn't feeling right. Investigators had been in and out of the home performing searches, speaking to family, like completing all the paperwork, and a few of them had heard a bit of a strange statement. So I already kind of went over the fact that it didn't seem like the house had been turned upside down looking for a little boy, like some things inside just weren't adding up. But it was things that people in the home were saying as well. Apparently, several officers heard baby Joe's little brother, 3-year-old Noah, come into, I guess, the living room to Aunt Joyce. And straight away, he said 3 times in a row, "Joe dead." Like, not necessarily a question. The way that they say it, like repeat what they heard, it sounds like more of a statement. But even more shockingly, Aunt Joyce replied to little Noah with, quote, "Yes, baby, Joe is dead." And it seems like these things were said as like authorities were in and out of the house. They weren't directly said in front of authorities, like they just overheard things while coming in or moving through the rooms. And so everyone's starting to wonder, what do they know that we don't? So while search teams were flooding the area and investigators were still searching the home and trying to piece together facts, Joseph Daniels was driving back and forth for hours along Garners Creek Road, saying that he was looking for his son. Like, pretty much, it seems like right when authorities first started to show up, he got in his car and he left. And at one point, investigators needed to speak to him. I think like one of the main investigators didn't show up till about 9 or 10, and they had to have Crystal call Joseph to tell him to come back home, like to speak to investigators. He was the one who reported his son as missing, which, I mean, I don't want to throw that out there as being something so weird because most parents would be looking for their child. But what made things a little more weird is that when Joseph did finally get back home, he ended up calling authorities and asked if they would come out and check the trunk of his car. And at this point, he gave them no reason why. And if it were me, I would probably be like, okay, I'm about to open this up to find this 5-year-old little boy in the back. Maybe that's just my paranoia speaking, but he gave no explanation for this. He's just like, I need someone to come and check the trunk of my car. And that was that. And so they did. They went out there, they looked in it, there was nothing there. And so they just kind of moved on. And so since Joseph had been out looking for baby Joe all morning, so he was exhibiting strange behavior, he said the things about the trunk, detectives decided around 1 p.m. that they wanted Joseph to ride along with them in the patrol car to retrace his steps. And not just because of all of those strange things that were starting to kind of tickle the back of their brain, but also he would know his son better than anyone. And they wanted to see, where did you search? Where do you think baby Joe might go? We need to see the areas you were looking for him, where you've ruled out. So he told them that he had searched from their home on Garners Creek Road all the way down toward the intersection at Harris Road, which is a very short stretch, but he had apparently been in this area for hours. And so they headed off in this direction. And on this drive, he again said what he told dispatch and investigators already. And meanwhile, he's kind of pointing toward ditches and thickets and open fields, saying, oh, I walked that way, I drove through this. But the problem was none of it seemed to be lining up. The tall grass that he was pointing at remained completely undisturbed. There were no visible footprints, no bent or broken branches or signs of recent passage in the tree lines that he swore he had checked thoroughly. And Joseph also couldn't seem to keep his own timeline straight. He kept changing up the order of events multiple times. Oh no, I went here next. No, wait a minute, I went there. And he was misidentifying turns and locations, and he was even contradicting some earlier statements that he had made not very long before. And so it started to feel more like someone trying to last minute patch together a believable story instead of someone recalling memories, which is especially strange because he had just come home from searching all of these areas. But this all could be chalked up to fear. A lot of people forget what they're doing and can't recall these memories as easily when they're in the midst of experiencing something where their adrenaline is peaked and there's so much going on. But then there were more odd statements from Joseph that authorities couldn't shake. Now, he went on to continue to suggest that they look into Love's truck stop as a place that baby Joe would have gone, and he also admitted that the reason why he asked them to search the trunk of his car was because baby Joe had learned how to open it, and he was worried baby Joe might be in there. But those weren't the strangest things. Joseph suddenly remembered something about the night before that seemed pretty significant to authorities. Joseph very candidly said that he had in fact been woken up the night before because baby Joe had apparently urinated on the floor. And he said that he went in and he dealt with it and put baby Joe back to bed, but he very specifically said he hadn't screamed at him or spanked him for it. Oftentimes when investigators are looking for strange things in what people are saying, their behavior, their language, an overuse of details or explaining things that haven't been asked, all of those things are huge red flags. By the end of day 1, law enforcement still had no sign of baby Joe, but what they did have was doubt. Some pretty serious doubt, and it was beginning to change everything about how they were approaching the case. By the morning of April 5th, the search had expanded rapidly. The TBI had brought in even more resources, more canine teams, more helicopters, more ground crews. I think it was like over 20 different organizations or local agencies had joined in on the search, and they continued to scour nearby woods and trails and surrounding properties for any trace of a 5-year-old. But something about the scene just kept on bothering investigators because despite all these extensive searches, the same thing that they were dealing with the day before, there was no sign of a little boy that had run away. The public was also very eager to help, but volunteers were asked at the moment to stay clear from the area. Authorities didn't want the tracking dogs to be be deterred by any other human scent, which is another reason why even baby Joe's family couldn't be out there looking for him. But Joseph Daniels was still doing what he could. He continued that day to speak to the media, but still behind the scenes, authorities were starting to shift their focus. And while the public still believed that baby Joe had run off and investigators were still looking for him as if he had, they didn't seem so sure anymore. Nothing about the evidence, or really the lack of it, matched the story that they had been told by Joseph Daniels. They began quietly narrowing in on the people inside of baby Joe's home. Authorities began to interview teachers and community members who knew the family, and what they started to uncover brought up even more concerns. So, a lot of the different educators that worked very closely with baby Joe ended up telling authorities that he would often come to school dirty, sometimes in the same clothes, multiple days in a row. People that are diagnosed with autism can have very strong preferences, and there's no talking them out of it. So while that could have been chalked up to a situation like that, especially because he was very particular about his clothes and about his shirt and his jeans and his boots, it could also be indicative of something else. When it came to his hygiene, that was a little more concerning. He shouldn't be showing up to school dirty. I've also seen on a handful of sources that there had potentially been some sort of involvement with the family before and Department of Child Services, but the information was sealed, so I'm unsure the extent of that or if that's even true. But there clearly were some sort of issues going on within the home. And one teacher also ended up telling authorities something that really stuck out to them. Now, this teacher had been working one-on-one with baby Joe on an alphabet game that was actually a lock and a key. And so essentially, the lock would have a letter on it, whether it was uppercase or lowercase, and the key would also have a letter on it, uppercase or lowercase. And you had to match the uppercase to the lowercase. And if you got the answer right, if you matched it perfectly, you could then unlock the lock and it would open. And his teacher was able to say that he did in fact match some of the uppercase letters to their lowercase letters a handful of times, but he never was able to get past that. Because of his delays in his motor skills, being in the first percentile, he had never been able to successfully put the key in the hole, twist it, and unlock the whole thing. And so that was a very interesting thing to hear, given the fact that it had been claimed baby Joe moved a table, located a key, put a key in a lock, not even just regularly, but high above his head. It's all seeming even more unbelievable at this point. They also ended up finding a pretty disturbing pattern of abused and neglected dogs being dumped from the Daniels home, which again doesn't directly speak to their ability to parent, but more so just the kind of behavior that was acceptable in the home. And interestingly, just days before baby Joe went missing, there were 2 dogs that had been dumped miles away by Crystal and Joseph. And they were covered in fleas and emaciated. And I guess this was just a regular occurrence. They would have dogs, they would not feed them, would not care for them, and then would just toss them out on the side of the road where they would no longer have to deal with it anymore. So clearly, there were things going on behind the scenes that made everyone worry for baby Joe's safety. This house was not the best place to be. But even as suspicion began to mount, the search for Joe continued with full force. They didn't have enough to really point to anything specific. They had to keep on looking for him. And so at this point, hundreds of volunteers flooded into Dickson from surrounding counties. They were allowing the public to come and help at this point. There were people that showed up with boots and backpacks and horses. They searched ravines and scoured fence lines. They walked shoulder to shoulder through open fields. Local churches also began to organize food drop-offs and water stations for all the search crews because there was that many people there. Businesses printed flyers. The TBI also issued multiple alerts to the media outlets, reminding the public of Joe's appearance. 3'9", 50 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, and last seen wearing skeleton pajamas. But still in the background, they were digging deeper into baby Joe's family life. The TBI began to pull Joseph's phone records. They looked at timestamps and location pings and app usage. And they also examined the family's internet history and social media activity. Meanwhile, forensic teams were swabbing parts of the home for DNA, especially areas near the back door and the master bedroom. By the following day of April 6th, Joseph Daniels and Crystal Daniels were asked to come in the station for a round of questioning. And this time, authorities decided they wanted to approach this a little differently. And so they started to confront Joseph Daniels about all of the contradictions, about all of the things that weren't making sense, the holes in his story. And it was an incredibly long interview. Now, for over an hour, Joseph held very firm. He repeated the same version that he had told authorities from the beginning, with just a few more added details. He confirmed he went to bed at 10 the night before and said that he had woken up at around 11:30 p.m. when baby Joe had an accident. And he specifically said that Alex, the oldest brother, ended up coming to wake him up to tell him about this. But he said he put the kids to bed and went back to sleep himself, and everything was fine until 5:20 when he woke up to get the boys ready for school. And he was even able to describe the night before in detail, that they had had pizza and cake, and how baby Joe was upset because he was told he had to eat all of his pizza before he would be able to have dessert. But he didn't think that that would make baby Joe so upset he would decide to run away. If you watch the interview, it genuinely does seem like he's trying to figure out what happened to baby Joe and any reason that baby Joe would have wanted to run away or what could have happened to him as the interview is going on. And at one point, Joseph even hinted that maybe Crystal had something to do with baby Joe's disappearance. He said that Big Joe and Belle had always been worried that she would harm him. They didn't like the way she treated him, and so he was even considering that his wife, the mother of his child, was involved. And he continued to say that this was his biggest fear, baby Joe running off, and that's why he had taken so many steps to prevent it. And like I said, I've watched this whole entire interview, and he repeated these same things several times. Occasionally, it seemed like they would demand for him to tell the truth, and he would add details, but they would be like very minor. It was like they would push him and he would feel like he had to add something. And so he would, but it would be things like, instead of saying that he told baby Joe to do something, he'd be like, well, maybe I raised my voice a little to tell him to do something. And then instead of saying, get back to bed, he would say, maybe I said, get your butt back to bed. And detectives repeatedly told him, you're changing your story, stop changing your story. But again, in my personal opinion, he just wasn't saying the exact same words verbatim. But the gist of the story itself had stayed the same. And so they were using some pretty intense tactics when it came to questioning him. And it honestly doesn't seem like it really even registered to him at the time that authorities were worried he had harmed his son. He seemed to be more worried that they believed he had willingly let baby Joe out of the house. Like he had left the door unlocked and allowed baby Joe to run away. Like it just did not seem like dots were connecting. But despite what it may have seemed like with him being confused and, thinking the absolute worst was that he let baby Joe out of the house, ultimately, with more pressure, Joseph broke, and the story that he told was devastating. Almost 2 hours into his interview, Joseph started to admit that sometimes things happen and he doesn't always remember those things. And at this point, he started to get pretty emotional. He started crying, and the detectives started asking him just a rapid fire list of questions. They started to ask, did you get upset after baby Joe peed on the floor? Because the big thing before was, did you get mad? And he said, well, maybe I raised my voice. And so now they're like, did this set you off? And he ended up saying yes, that he punished baby Joe and he made baby Joe go outside, that he shut the door behind him and left baby Joe out in the dark, out in the storm. But then things again started to shift and detectives started asking more questions. And he said maybe he subconsciously locked the door behind him, so baby Joe couldn't even get back in if he tried. He then went on to further say that maybe, quote, something more happened after that between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. But he's not giving specifics. He just keeps saying, well, maybe this happened, and maybe I did this, and maybe I did that. At one point, he even said that he was the one who put the lock in the toy basket himself. But ultimately, he started to talk about that something more that may have happened. Joseph said that after baby Joe urinated on the floor, he did put him back to bed, and baby Joe ended up coming back outside laughing about the fact that he had urinated on the floor. Like he thought it was funny. And Joseph Joseph said they'd had issues with getting baby Joe to get in bed and stay in bed and sleep at night. And so he got frustrated, even more so that I guess he felt like he was being mocked. He was being laughed at. And so he lost it. He said that he started to spank baby Joe, and baby Joe responded by running outside. I guess at some point he claimed he unlocked the door and left the lock off. And so he chased baby Joe outside and brought him back in the house and continued his punishment by spanking him. But apparently baby Joe got out a second time, and this time he managed to make it all the way to the road. And this really made Joseph angry. And so he said that he went back out there to get him, but at this point he blacked out. This was one of the moments where he couldn't remember what happened. All he knew is that when he came back to, it was the next morning and baby Joe was missing. But he seemed pretty adamant, even admitting all of this, that he never harmed baby Joe. Even in that moment where he blacked out, he doesn't think he would kill his child.
Like, I remember still insulted, but the problem was I don't remember what happened. I kind of sort of remember, I'm thinking that's what happened, but I really don't. That's what you're telling us. You're not making that up, right? And the door was slightly open, car door, so I figured he may have opened the car door and opened the trunk and got into the trunk. That's why I was saying, hey, can you guys check the trunk of the car to see if he's in there? Roll me to Mitchell. It's a lot more, Craig. I got blacked out. You're quite right.
Tell me tell me what a second.
Joe, when you black out, you don't have a memory and you don't know what you're lying. But when you know it, Joe, that's part I don't know if that's what happened or not. I mean, I'm just speculating that's part would have happened or.
And so authorities are like, okay, well, you're stepping closer to telling us what really happened, but we know it has to be something more. Like there's something at the end of this. There's something when you blacked out. And again, the story changes. This time, even though he was adamant he never harmed his son, Joseph admits that he actually got so angry, he began to strike his son multiple times with a closed fist on his head, on his body. And when he realized he had taken it too far, it was already too late because baby Joe was no longer moving. He then admitted that he had slammed baby Joe on the coffee table, which gave baby Joe a scratch on his leg, but he didn't remember ever seeing blood.
He did more than spanking, bitch.
Yeah. But tell me exactly what you did. More than spank. How'd you beat her?
So what for?
How many? When else did you spank her?
What is all for? So what, coffee table?
Where did he hit on the coffee table?
What hit him on the coffee table?
Where did he hit on the coffee table?
Middle of the coffee table.
Did you lose track of how many times you hit him?
Oh, how many times?
You just kept in? Was he crying?
Yeah.
How long do you think that lasted for?
5-10 minutes.
And he said that instead of calling 911 or rendering aid after he literally beat his son to death, he panicked. And so he carried baby Joe's body out of the house and placed him in the trunk of his car. He then drove to a rural area along McElhaney Road where all those dogs attract the scent, and he said he disposed of baby Joe's body in a remote grassy area along a tree line. He even claimed that he had taken Crystal's phone with him when he did that to be able to use the flashlight to see. And in the midst of admitting all of this horror about what he had done to his little boy, he also admitted that Alex, baby Joe's older brother, had witnessed the entire thing and that he had threatened Alex if he told anyone what happened. Joseph continued on to admit to authorities that he never believed baby Joe was actually his child, that he thought someone else was the father, and that Crystal was actively cheating on him, and that the night that he killed baby Joe, he and Crystal had actually argued about that specifically. And so after admitting all of this information, Joseph Daniels was immediately arrested and charged with criminal homicide, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence, and his bond was set at $1 million. And this whole confession left everyone with such mixed feelings because, first of all, this was never the outcome anyone hoped for. And Joseph, according to everyone looking in from the outside, had been going around and searching for his son, pleading with the media. But this left them with more questions than answers, because did Joseph tell the whole truth? With all of the times that his story changed, how could anyone know what was real and what wasn't? Was baby Joe really dumped nearby? And if so, why hadn't they found him yet? And also, what role did Crystal play? Did she help cover all this up? Did she know what was going on? Or did all of this play out in the middle of the night when she was sleeping and had no idea? And so at this point, the search for Joe shifted again. No longer a rescue mission. Now it was about recovery and justice. The next phase of this case was about to begin, and it was one that would haunt Dickson for years to come because it got so much more traumatizing. Now, despite Joseph Daniels' confession, the days following his arrest were filled with so much back and forth and uncertainty and extreme amounts of frustration. Joseph had told investigators that he struck Joe Clyde and placed his body in this rural area off of a road near the home. And so immediately after this confession, he agreed to hop in the car with law enforcement and show them where he had left baby Joe. But immediately things began to fall apart. Search teams followed his lead. They went and looked at every possible area that Joseph claimed he put his child for 5 hours. But not a single trace of baby Joe was ever found. Joseph also began making comments through the entire ride. He said that he wanted the money donated to aid in the search to go instead to his son's funeral. He said that Alex was a good boy who wouldn't lie, and that he had already spoken to the Children's Advocacy Center and probably already told them everything. He also said that he had been so scared and was acting so terrified and emotional because he thought his dad was going to kill him if he found out what happened to baby Joe, what he did to baby Joe. And he kept saying he needed to apologize to Crystal. I mean, it was just one thing after another after another. He was clearly having like an emotional meltdown in the back of the car. But no matter where they took him, he could never actually say where baby Joe was. He'd be like, well, I think it's right here. This looks familiar. No, maybe this isn't it. Maybe it's over here. Like, it was just all over the place. And obviously, none of the areas he gave were correct because they never found baby Joe or signs that anyone had been dumped there or buried there. No dogs picked up on a scent, nothing. And so this was the first of many red flags that made authorities start to question details of his confession. Was Joseph lying to protect someone? Was he lying to protect himself? Had the trauma of what happened distorted his memory? Or was the confession itself false? I mean, there were so many questions running through everyone's mind. But ultimately, Joseph ended up answering some of those questions because after these hours and hours of searching, as he's about to be taken to jail, he's like, you know what? I lied. I lied about where I buried my son. And so he ended up writing a second confession where he changed up a few details and where he took baby Joe, and then he was immediately whisked off to jail. Within hours, Joseph was already making requests to have someone put him in contact with the TBI because according to him, he wanted to finally tell them the truth about where he put baby Joe for closure. And so they immediately reach out to him to figure out what he has to say. And now he begins telling authorities that he actually tossed his son over a bridge into a body of water. He began to explain to them that he, went to Love's truck stop and bought himself a Dr. Pepper. And then he left from there at some point, stopped at a nearby bridge and decided to toss baby Joe's body in because baby Joe, quote, loved water. And so for a second time, he agreed to ride with Ellie to look for this location where he dumped his son's body. And so they end up going to 4 different bridges. They're in the car again for another handful of hours. And it seems like he knows what he's talking about. He remembers like specific names of the bridge and all these different things. But when they actually go to these locations, he can never actually pinpoint which one he threw Baby Joe over. So just like that first search, when he claimed Baby Joe had been put in a field somewhere, they're starting to doubt if this is the truth either. Like, it just seems like he's leading them on a wild goose chase. And so after this search ended up failing, authorities went back to the command center that was near Joseph's house, and they actually let Joseph's dad, Big Joe, in the car to speak with him. And I don't know if they were hoping he would maybe have a moment with his son and get his son to tell the truth, because he had expressed like how fearful he was of his dad finding out. But regardless, I guess Joseph ended up confessing to his father that he killed Baby Joe. But it doesn't seem like he went into any more detail about it or gave any more helpful information. But he also confirmed several other details again, that Alex had seen everything. So he is saying the same things over and over and over again. Alex saw it, and he killed his son. And then ultimately, he ended up revealing that he could not remember where he put Baby Joe's body. And so I guess he was trying to insinuate that he had been trying to remember, and that's why he was going to all these places and telling them to search all these areas, but ultimately, he really didn't know. So everyone felt incredibly defeated. But then there was another shocking revelation the following day of April 8th. Crystal had been brought in for questioning as well, and her own admission was equally as devastating as what Joseph said. She ended up telling authorities that she actually had heard Baby Joe scream that night of the 3rd into the 4th. And so she went out to go and check on him and ended up walking in to find Joseph standing over Baby Joe, beating him with a closed fist. So this perfectly matches what Joseph had already told authorities he had done to his son. She said that when Joseph noticed she was there, he turned and tried to hit her as well, but he missed and instead threatened to kill her if she told anyone about it. And so out of fear, she turned around and ran back to her room horrified. And a few minutes later, she decided to sneak back out to the living room, and both Baby Joe and Joseph were gone. And it doesn't seem like she necessarily knew or was specifically told what happened afterward. At least there's not a lot of information out there about it, but it became pretty obvious that she knew something was very wrong. So Crystal Daniels was arrested as well and charged with aggravated child neglect. Joseph continued at this point to give multiple conflicting accounts, not only of where he put Baby Joe, because he did continue to give several other areas he put him, but also what happened that night and why he allegedly struck and killed his son. I mean, he just kept on changing up his reasonings, his explanations, his locations, and in some of them he took full responsibility. In others, he said that Baby Joe was fine after he hit him as punishment, but hours later was found dead. And each of these versions just continued to conflict with the others, and each time Joseph was pressed for more information, the story would change. This constant shift in this narrative ended up becoming the biggest challenge for investigators who were still desperately trying to find Joe Clyde. At this point, you're clearly not telling us the truth. Like, we at this point just need to find your little boy, bring him peace, figure out what actually happened, and move forward. And it was feeling impossible. Law enforcement were still out there. They were still searching the area around the Daniels residence way more thoroughly now. They also began reviewing available surveillance footage from nearby properties, hoping that maybe it would give them some sort of insight. Now, they were able to find footage from a neighbor's camera on Pruitt Springs Road, which was about 300 yards from the Daniels home. It was on its own road, but like the way the fields were and the way the camera was pointing, it pointed towards the Daniels driveway. And so the video ended up documenting that at 10:06 p.m. on April 3rd, the night before Baby Joe went missing, a vehicle did pull into the driveway of a neighbor's home. It paused and then it backed out of the driveway. And the driver couldn't be identified from the footage. And when investigators tried to recreate this, they actually determined that they didn't think it was a car at all, that maybe it was a flashlight or something along those lines. So while it didn't really establish anything, it at least showed there was some late night activity near the Daniels residence. But what they were hoping to see was something that showed Joseph leaving the house after he allegedly killed baby Joe, like he said in his confession, to go and dispose of baby Joe's body. Because they're like, okay, we at least need to see what direction he went in. Maybe that will help us narrow down his many stories. But they didn't really find it. There was actually no movement at all from the home until the following morning, just before the 911 call was made. And so at around 6:15 a.m., that same camera on Pruitt Road captured headlights at the Daniels property. And it looked like a car pulled either around back or from the back of the house, which is where they went in and out of the home. And then it left southbound, so going towards Harris Road and where the Love's truck stop was. And the vehicle ended up returning at around 6:25 a.m. So the car was only gone for 10 minutes and showed back up just a minute before that 911 call was made. And so this was pretty interesting to authorities because they wondered maybe Joseph had gone out for those 10 brief minutes to look for baby Joe, or did he go put baby Joe's body somewhere so that he'd be able to call 911 and no one would find him at the home. Now, additionally, more surveillance ended up being found at a large property called Bethany's Retreat, just south of the family's home. They had a gate camera that was positioned to face Garners Creek Road, and it ended up recording Joseph Daniels' vehicle traveling south at 7:51 a.m. on April 4th. And so this would have been after baby Joe was reported as missing when Joseph was off on his search for his son. And so he made several passes back and forth. But why this was interesting is that, like I already said, this was a very small area. And so it made authorities wonder at this point, maybe he only had enough time to move his son's body just far enough away from the house so authorities didn't find him immediately, but maybe he knew he needed to move it further. So he left right after reporting baby Joe is missing to move his body under the guise of searching for him. But obviously that surveillance footage isn't going to prove any of that, but it does confirm some of the movements in and out of the home. Now, while reviewing surveillance footage and following up on Joseph's confession to try to connect more dots, investigators also started to look into some of the tips that they had received from the community. And probably one of the most notable ones came from a man named Danelle McCormick. Now, he had actually been driving to work around the time searches were ongoing in the Garners Creek area, and he stopped out of curiosity and asked, what's going on? There's so many people here. And he ended up being told there was a missing person. And he told them that he might have information that could help. Danelle ended up claiming that he had been coming home from work in the early morning hours of April 4th. And he said that his drive home from work actually took him up Garners Creek Road. He said that he had stopped at that same Love's gas station that I keep bringing up, and authorities were able to confirm that he did this at 12:28 a.m. So shortly after, Joseph claimed to have killed his son. And then Danelle McCormick said after the stop, he headed directly up Garners Creek Road. At around 12:30 a.m., he ended up seeing what looked like a child wearing some sort of skeleton shirt on the side of the road. And so obviously that is huge because that's what Joseph claimed baby Joe was wearing. And the Pruitt Springs camera, that camera only a couple hundred yards from the Daniels home, confirmed that Daniels' car drove by this area around 12:42. So all these timelines are starting to match up. However, he claimed that this didn't look like a 5-year-old little boy, that this looked more like a teenager. It was a bigger person. And the colors that he described seeing on the outfit, interestingly, matched the red shorts and an alien shirt that Joseph claimed to be wearing the night that this all happened. And so authorities were like, okay, maybe this could have been baby Joe. Maybe he just looked older because it was dark and he had actually run from the home. Maybe he got further than Joseph said, or maybe this was Joseph in the process of trying to get rid of baby Joe's body. But again, there was no footage of anyone driving from the Daniels home during this time, and so they still weren't quite sure what any of this meant. Now, another witness ended up coming forward, claiming that she was driving down Garners Creek Road about an hour later at 1:30 a.m., and she too saw a man standing on a bridge on the road. And this man was wearing red shorts and a multicolored shirt. And when she saw Joseph's picture on the news after his arrest, she was confident that that was who she saw. Now, she hadn't reported any of this until after Joseph's arrest, which obviously caused a lot of people to be skeptical. But some of the details seemed pretty important because I don't think she knew what he had been wearing that night. I always say the cliche phrase that there's always bits of truth in a lie. And if you look at Joseph's story as a whole, It seems to be sprinkled throughout it. He wanted them to check his trunk, giving no explanation. And then he ultimately confessed that he put baby Joe in his trunk. He asked them to look at Love's truck stop, and he ultimately confessed in one of his versions that he stopped there on the way to dispose of his son's body. He talked about a bridge. Now there's one person specifically seeing him on a bridge in the middle of the night, around the time he could have dumped baby Joe's body. It all seemed to be trying to tell the same story. But authorities just weren't finding any solid evidence otherwise. They had these random bits of surveillance footage, these witness statements that seemed to make it make sense, but there was nothing to connect all of it. And so authorities started to look into the couple's movements, their communication. Several pieces of potential evidence were sent in for forensic testing, but unfortunately, the accuracy of a lot of this evidence was already questionable because authorities ended up noticing while they were scrambling to put together a potential criminal case after they've treated this like a missing persons case this whole time, that photos had been taken at the home on the 4th, the day that baby Joe was missing. And so far, a deep investigation looking for evidence hadn't been done on the house. But then, once Joseph was arrested, they went back. They wanted to take more photos in depth, do a more in-depth forensic investigation, and they noticed that it appeared like the whole house had been cleaned. And so they started to worry that maybe evidence in the home had been destroyed. And so at this point, authorities knew they needed to try to dig deeper to find not just more evidence of what may have happened, but where Joseph actually put his son. And so they not only started looking at his movements of the night before baby Joe was potentially killed into those early morning hours as he was reported missing, but also what Joseph had been doing after that. And they ended up finding out that during that window of time, while searchers were desperately combing the area for baby Joe, that morning, hours after he'd been reported as missing, while Joseph was out driving those circles in the area, he was also making a lot of personal calls, unrelated to the investigation. So apparently, he had called Nashville State Community College early that morning, like right after he left the house to search for his son, to ask them during this drive, looking for his son, if they could confirm his past employment. He apparently was applying for a job. He had received an email the day before, and they weren't able to confirm his past employment at the school, and so he needed to know if there was any way they could give him something that could prove it. Seems like an odd thing to be trying to do in the hours after your child goes missing. And then at 10 a.m., again, while he's out and about looking for his son, he used an app to scan his W-2, and then he emailed that W-2 to himself and then forwarded it to that potential employer. Why on earth was he out there doing all of those things while his son had just gone missing? Authorities continued to track his movements after this, and they found that after investigators and searchers had left the Daniels home into the early morning hours of the 5th, Joseph ended up leaving his house again. It was around 2 a.m., and surveillance footage from Pruitt Road captured his car pulling out of the house, and he ended up heading straight to the Love's truck stop. Again, the same location, and he arrived there at about 2:44 a.m. He apparently went inside and made a small purchase before leaving. He was very quiet and he left in literally a matter of moments. But that wasn't the end of it. At around 3:03 a.m., so just 15 minutes later, Joseph, for whatever reason, returned to the Love's gas station. And apparently, there was a woman that worked there that followed behind him as he went to make the second trip to Love's. She lived off of, I think it was Harris, and she pulled out behind him and said that he was going so slow the entire way down this road, and she could not figure out why he was driving so slowly, but it was really odd to her. And so when she pulled into this gas station right behind him, she was on high alert because she wasn't sure what his behavior was about. It's the middle of the night, and she said when he got out, he popped the hood of his car, but then he walked away from it. His behavior was just a little bit strange. And according to surveillance footage and employees, Joseph went back inside this Love's truck stop. Now, he talked to several staff members while he was there. He was showing them photos of baby Joe, but he was there for 6 or 7 minutes, which was a pretty stark contrast to his trip before where he said nothing to anyone, walked in, made a quick purchase and left. Now he's making sure he talks to several people at the gas station, which to me is just screaming, I'm trying to create an alibi, but I digress. I'm not a professional. What do I know? But don't worry. It gets even more bizarre because almost immediately after Joseph leaves, Big Joe, Joseph's dad, calls the Love truck stop twice, and he asks the staff if Joseph had showed up there, what he had said, and if the police had stopped by to ask them questions. And so investigators are like, that is unusual, to say the least, because it almost seemed as if Joseph's own family was starting to suspect something was off. Maybe they needed confirmation from outside sources. I mean, it just seems weird. And by 3:28 a.m., surveillance footage shows Joseph returning home. And so at this point, investigators started to form a quiet theory. Again, small bits of truth and a lie. They started to believe that maybe this was, in fact, when he disposed of Joe's body. Maybe he did go to Love's like he claimed in one of those admissions and got himself a Dr. Pepper before disposing of him. But maybe instead of throwing his son off a bridge like he claimed, he placed baby Joe's body in a dumpster behind the Love's truck stop. And it would have been taken to a landfill before anyone even knew to look for baby Joe there. But again, it's just one of those things, like with the trunk. It felt like Joseph wanted someone to catch him. Like he knew he did something wrong. He could not say it on his own, and he was trying to get people to catch him. And so it is so frustrating for it to feel like that, but then to also see him tell so many different stories about ultimately where baby Joe is and the fact that he's saying he doesn't remember. It's like so hard to believe that. Now, despite this theory, there was no public landfill search ever confirmed, and there wasn't really a press release. No one from the police department really spoke about this. It was mentioned a few years later that they considered this the most plausible theory, but nothing was immediately done. And if you're familiar with Corey McCaig, I covered his case quite some time ago. They ultimately decided that he likely ended up in the landfill, and they did decide to divert all the attention to searching a landfill. But the amount of resources that takes is just wild. It takes so much manpower, so much time. And so it's a really hard decision for a lot of these investigating agencies to decide to completely switch their search efforts to a landfill search because it pretty much takes over the investigation. So I'm not too surprised they didn't decide to do this because it likely wouldn't have provided anything. And since he gave so many other possibilities of areas around the home, I understand why they continued to search there. But how heartbreaking is it to think that this sweet little boy may have been discarded like garbage and lost forever? I feel like of all the places you could find a body, someone could dispose of a body. And I don't mean to sound macabre or what have you. It's all awful. But, being in the forest, you can try to look at a bright side of that. There's nature. It's beautiful, peaceful. You can attempt to find some sort of peace knowing that your loved one was there. But a landfill, I would be so devastated. And unfortunately, even with all the manpower, the technology, the confession, baby Joe has still never been found. In the weeks and months that followed Joseph's confession, things, as you can imagine, just continued to shift. Both Joseph and Crystal ended up recanting their confessions. They both decided to take them back. And Crystal very specifically said that she felt like she had been pressured by police to say what she did, that she was scared, she was overwhelmed, she didn't fully understand what she was agreeing to during the interviews and saying. And so she basically claimed everything was said under emotional duress. She was coerced and she wanted to take it all back. But it bothers me so badly because everything she said, everything comes full circle. Everything comes full circle. I'll just say that. And Joseph was also walking his story back. He now was saying that he had never harmed his son, that his confession was also the result of stress and confusion and manipulation. And his attorneys really leaned hard into that narrative. And they started to publicly say before his trial that he had a history of mental health struggles, that he had a low IQ, and that the length of his interrogations and the tactics of his interrogations had a lot to do with this. And more specifically, they said that the investigators used the Reed technique, which I've gone into before. I'm not going to go into it in extreme detail here, but essentially the Reed technique is known for false confessions, which I have such a huge problem with that. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, like I said, everything to me comes back full circle. Now, these reversals, especially coming from both parents, just cast even more shadows over an already complex and emotionally charged case, and it added more weight to the questions the public had been asking from day one. What really happened to baby Joe? And so finally, after years of investigation and legal delays, the trial of Joseph Daniels began in June of 2021. And the public interest, as I'm sure you can imagine, was pretty high. I think they actually had to bring in like an outside jury because there was so much media on this particular case. It's not very often that you see a case where there are charges and there's no body. It's not a common thing. And so everyone was hoping that maybe in the course of this investigation, that there would be an answer, there would be an admission, there would be something that made everyone understand and would bring baby Joe home. The prosecution stepped forward hard and strong. They played Joseph's recorded confessions, several of them, for the jury, which was very painful to watch. There were also several written confessions from Joseph, and they did this to show, like, hey, he didn't confess one time because we forced him and pressured him and then took his confession back. Like, he confessed several times, not just to authorities in person on recorded interviews, but on paper, to his father in a police vehicle. Like, there were so many times that Joseph confessed to murdering his son. And they fought hard about this because this was one of the biggest things they had. The forensics that they sent in came back not very helpful. There was nothing at all, no evidence to even really support that baby Joe wasn't alive. Like, they had no amount of blood that said, hey, this was absolutely a fatal injury. He's no longer alive. There was nothing at all. They checked his clothes, they checked his car, they checked the trunk, they checked a shovel that they found at the house. I mean, anything they could possibly find that might come back as having baby Joe's blood on it or something to indicate his death. It was not fruitful. And so they were really relying on the confessions and witness testimony. And so several people testified for the prosecution. There were teachers, law enforcement, experts. But the turning point of it all was when Alex, Joe's half-brother, took the stand. And I don't think anyone knew he was going to come out or was expecting for him to come out. Alex told the court all about baby Joe and the events of that night and how they slept in their grandparents' room because the bed was really comfortable. So that was like a fun luxury for them. But then the night took a horrifying turn. He said that he woke up and baby Joe had urinated on the floor. So again, we're following the exact same thing that was in the confession and had been said pretty much from the beginning. And he woke up Joseph to tell him about this. And he said that Joseph came in, punished baby Joe, and then put them both back to bed. And at that point, everything was okay. I mean, he still punished baby Joe, but they were back to bed. However, he woke up shortly after this to hear a very loud banging noise.
What happened after that?
Well, I woke up from this loud bang. I didn't go in there immediately, but
I know this is tough. I know it's tough. Okay, Alex, let me back up just a little bit, all right? Now, you've already testified that Joe Clyde peed in the floor, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And that the defendant whipped him and that y'all went back to bed. And what happened next?
I woke up from a loud bang, and then I didn't go in there immediately, but I sat in there for a couple minutes, waited. Then I went in there. Saw him on the floor. Joseph had and a couple minutes after that, he took him out the door, laid him down in the yard.
And at that point, Joseph saw that he was witnessing whatever was going on, and he flew into a rage. Alex said that Joseph looked at him and threatened to kill him if he didn't help. He told Alex to open the back door and then go and open the trunk of a car on the property. He then, after this, demanded that Alex go back inside and never speak a word of what he saw ever again. But Alex said that horrified, he continued watching. He didn't go back inside. And so he peeked around the corner of the house and saw that instead of putting baby Joe in the trunk, like I guess he kind of assumed was going to happen since he was told to open the trunk, Joseph continued carrying baby Joe down the driveway. And so he crept further down the driveway to keep watching. He watched Joseph walk down Garner Creek Road, still carrying baby Joe in his arms. He eventually went back inside, forced himself to go to sleep because he was so scared of whatever he just saw. And then he was woken up just hours later by Joseph, who looked him directly in the eye after what he knew just happened and said that baby Joe was missing. Alex said that he helped to look for baby Joe, again, even knowing what he did, but obviously they never found him. And all of this honestly made perfect sense. No car was ever seen driving from the Daniels home in the middle of the night because maybe Joseph didn't take a car and instead he went on foot, so that wouldn't be seen. And maybe McCormick said he thought he saw a skeleton outfit, but it was a bigger man because maybe he was seeing Joseph carrying baby Joe. So he saw the outfit baby Joe was wearing, but saw the size of Joseph. Now, the defense immediately tore this apart, and I know that's their job, but it was so challenging to hear them question Alex like that. And they brought up the fact that Alex had done an interview at the Child Advocacy Center on the 5th of April, the day after his brother was reported as missing, and he told them a completely different story. Apparently, he told the Child Advocacy Center that baby Joe urinated on the floor, so all of that stayed the same, but that Joseph simply put them back to bed, and that was it, that nothing else happened throughout the night. He woke up, baby Joe was missing, and the defense also pointed out the fact that this entire time, these years after his brother had gone missing and was believed to have been murdered by Joseph, he had maintained the story that he didn't see anything. But then weeks before the trial, he agreed to testify against Joseph. Alex ended up saying that he had lied to the advocacy center, that his life had been threatened. I mean, when your stepfather says, "I will kill you," like, do not speak of this to anyone. When you are taken the following day and asked if you saw anything, you're probably not going to say that you did. And so he said he lied because he had to. He wanted to be safe. He wanted to get out of the interviews. He was uncomfortable. He was scared. And the interviewer themselves actually testified and said that Joseph was the one that brought Alex to that first interview. So if he had in fact threatened Alex, being the one to bring him there, Alex is definitely not going to say anything. And they even admitted that Alex seemed incredibly guarded during that first interview. And then in the second interview, it became pretty clear that Alex was hiding something. There was something that he wasn't saying. He started to confide in the interviewer that he did see other things happen in the house, but he wouldn't say what. And he started to kind of turn inward on himself to say that, maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was seeing things through someone else's eyes. It sounded very much like a kid that was going through trauma from what they had possibly seen.
They could be scared. Somebody could have threatened them. They're not ready to admit what has happened to them. They have to go back home to where it possibly is going to continue to happen.
Not just that, but the person that did the intake form on the 5th when Joseph took Alex in specifically noted odd behavior from Joseph. He apparently put like bunny ears up behind Alex's head and said, "How's that for abuse?" Like trying to make a joke, but it fell very, very flat given the circumstances. And repeatedly, he told him he didn't hurt his children. And then while he was filling out that intake form, it says on there like name of the victim. And when he saw the word victim, he freaked out and said that he didn't want that word to be on there, that no one was a victim. And then he proceeded to say, after getting frustrated about this, that he hoped that investigators found, quote, "that boy," referring to baby Joe. Also during this interview, there was something interesting mentioned that would become a pretty big deal during this trial. Alex apparently mentioned at this advocacy center that he and his mom were taking a trip to Kansas soon, and he seemed pretty excited about this, but Joseph immediately made a motion for Alex to be quiet, and Alex kind of shrunk into himself and never brought this Kansas trip up again, like would not speak about it another time. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of an 8-year-old's recollection, the memory, but the raw and the vivid nature of Alex's testimony left a pretty lasting impact on the jury. He seemed pretty confident in what he was saying, and the emotion behind it was so upsetting for everyone to see. Now, ultimately, after this, the defense chose not to call any witnesses, which was so strange because their whole entire case centered around the fact that they believe Joseph's confession was coerced. So if they believed that so wholeheartedly, why didn't they bring forward expert witnesses to talk about maybe the Reed technique or facts about coercion and false confessions? Maybe mental health experts. They didn't bring forward any of that, which was just very strange to me. But they continued to say, there's no body. There's all these changing stories from Joseph. Joseph just said what authorities wanted him to hear. They claimed that he was mentally ill, and he was specifically told that if he told the truth, he would walk out of the door and leave a free man. So he said what he thought they wanted to hear is the truth, and that was that. Now, Crystal Daniels never ended up taking the stand during Joseph's trial because the two of them were still legally married, so Crystal could not be forced to testify against her husband, something that just further complicated the prosecution's case. So instead, the prosecutors introduced a ton of evidence that painted a much fuller picture of Crystal's state of mind in the months leading up to Joe's disappearance, how that affected the family dynamic, her relationship with Joseph, and how that affected Joseph leading up to baby Joe's disappearance as well. So apparently, Joseph was not wrong when it came to Crystal actively cheating on him. They ended up finding in her Facebook messages that she was having conversations with a man named Thomas, and this began back in February of 2018. And all of these messages show just how unsatisfied she was with her life, with her marriage. She said that she hadn't been happy for 3 years at that point, and she seemed to be starting a relationship with this Thomas guy. She constantly complained about Joseph and his family. She said that his parents controlled him, that he never defended her, and she said that she was going to leave Joseph. And she said that she was so serious about that she'd actually just torn up their marriage license and had divorce papers drawn up. She also claimed in these messages that she had already applied for Section 8 housing. She was planning on getting out of Joseph's house with their children, and that she was going to be relying on the $1,200 she received monthly for baby Joe, and that was how she was going to make it on her own. She kept saying, I'm pretty sure if I have that money consistently, I'll be able to be okay. But then out of nowhere, the communication between Crystal and this man stopped, almost as if someone had caught Crystal talking to him. But all of a sudden, those first few days of April, right as Joe vanished, that communication resumed again. And so the timing of all of this raised a lot of eyebrows. Meanwhile, Joseph's activity online took a pretty dark turn. On March 30th, just days before baby Joe went missing, Joseph searched for, quote, anonymous parental testing. He browsed several paternity testing websites, and he specifically looked up how to perform a paternity test without the mother or the father of the child knowing. So clearly he was questioning the paternity. And the next day, on March 31st, Joseph texted his own mother saying, quote, F this world, by the time you see this message, I'll be 6 feet under. Joseph also ended up visiting several websites for Southwest Airlines, Enterprise, Greyhound buses, and all of them he was specifically trying to search for transportation to Wichita, Kansas. Interestingly, that is exactly where Thomas, Crystal's online boyfriend situation, lived. So clearly, Joseph knew about this man, and it connects the fact that Alex had mentioned in the advocacy center that he and his mom were going to Kansas soon, and Joseph quickly shutting him down. It seems to have possibly been the catalyst for a lot of what happened. And then, on the morning of April 3rd, the day before Joe was reported missing, Crystal texted Joseph saying, hey, where are you? To which he responded, quote, mental health. There were some serious issues in the home. Now, obviously, the defense ended up arguing this as well, saying that the Facebook messages were sent from Alex's tablet, so it might not have even been Crystal. They also questioned whether Joseph actually ever saw them, that there was no way to prove that, which they're not wrong. But regardless of who knew what, the prosecution leaned on the timing and the tone of the messages. They were like, this house was on the verge of collapse right before baby Joe goes missing and is now believed to have been killed. So as those disturbing layers of the Daniels home began coming to light, the trial reached its final days. And at this point, the prosecution suggested that there had been long-standing issues between Joseph and Crystal in their marriage. And maybe Joseph found out that Crystal planned to leave him, and it really made him snap. He would have seen in those messages that she planned and relied on the money she got from baby Joe's disability to to get out of this marriage, to move somewhere else, to eventually be with another man. And his solution to that was taking that from her by killing baby Joe, someone that he, at this point, believed was not even his child. The defense also obviously pushed back on this. At one point, they even suggested that Alex, an 8-year-old, was an accomplice in the crime, which to me was a very disgusting thing to suggest. But ultimately, the jury didn't believe any of what the defense was trying to say. They believed that Joseph's own words, along with all of the circumstantial evidence, told a clear enough story. They found him guilty on multiple counts: murder, aggravated child abuse, initiating a false report, and tampering with evidence. And while this was a legal resolution, no one walked out of that courtroom feeling like the case had truly been closed. There's still a little boy that's been murdered. There's still a little boy that is missing. They have no gravesite, no final goodbye, no answers for a grieving family and a community. And for those who had spent months or even years searching, hoping, and praying, they were all left with a verdict but no justice, because without Joe's body, that one question was still unanswered of where is he? And while you probably think the most shocking moments in this case have already passed, there's still, unfortunately, so much more. Because during sentencing, new revelations emerged that left so many people stunned even further. Now, a move was made by the defense at this point that honestly just pissed me off, because after they refused to bring forward any witnesses to the murder trial, the defense all of a sudden, now that he's been found guilty, wanted to file a last-minute motion to call in new witnesses at the sentencing and recall Alex for additional testimony. When it came to Alex, they made it clear that they wanted to recall him to challenge his memory and potentially cast doubt on his eyewitness account. But the judge heard that and was like, absolutely not. The jury's already reached their conclusion. We're not arguing over guilt or not at this point. Like, this is sentencing, and the only thing the defense was trying to do was to attempt to bring Alex back and disprove things that had already been proven, and that's not the way the court works. However, the defense was able to bring in Aunt Joyce, and apparently she wasn't able to testify at the original trial because she suffered with hearing loss, and she didn't have hearing aids at the time, so it would have been too challenging for her to take the stand and understand what people were saying and all of the things. And so that's really the only reason they even successfully were able to bring her back to testify at the sentencing. And she didn't even end up really helping their case, because she claimed that Crystal and Joseph were arguing the night that baby Joe went missing, and she even admitted that Crystal told her Joseph was not baby Joe's father. So this just further proved the tension. And the only thing she really said that I guess maybe could have helped the defense was that she didn't hear anything happen that night. She didn't hear any altercation, but she also had pretty serious hearing loss, so that to me is not like the most groundbreaking testimony ever. But there was still groundbreaking testimony at the sentencing, and it came from a man named John McGranahan, and he was a juvenile probation officer who I guess had worked with Joseph Daniels as a teenager. And what he said, I don't even know. I have no words. I'll just tell you and you can form your own thoughts. Now, McGranahan testified that Joseph apparently, which no one knew, had a long documented history of violent behavior and very disturbing fantasies. These issues had gone back to when Joseph was only 7 or 8 years old, so we're talking like there were some serious problems pretty early on, and they just got worse. As a teenager, he said that Joseph had spoken openly about wanting to bomb his home, he was going to use chemicals, and he had shared plans of that with people. He also shared plans with people about the fact that he wanted to strangle several of his classmates. I mean, he had very vivid, planned out homicidal ideations. He also had apparently told his stepmom at one point that he wanted to kill her as well, which landed him in a mental health hospital. And he went on to also tell people at school that he wanted to bite their nose off, that he wanted to eat their faces. So we're not talking like, oh, he was just like occasionally a little violent. Like, he exhibited psychopathic behavior from a very young age. He had threatened to tie his stepmom to the bed and beat her. He threatened to burn his house down. He punched holes in walls, and it was documented that his behavior worsened when he didn't get his way. And he would have what Joseph would refer to as blackouts, where he would lose all awareness of his actions during his moments of rage, which is very interesting to note. And most devastatingly, McGranahan said that Joseph's parents had been warned repeatedly about their son's behavior. It was just escalating. It was beyond anyone's control. They were told that their son needed serious, sustained mental health treatment, but unfortunately, no meaningful intervention ever came for him. And so as an adult, he didn't hold most of his jobs he got directly because of his mental health. So we're not just simply talking about someone that maybe was in a bad situation with his wife and snapped. We're talking about someone who, for majority of their life, wanted to kill people, and unfortunately acted that out for the very first time on his own son. He had been recognized for years as someone that was a danger. Those red flags went unaddressed, and in the end, his little boy paid the ultimate price. All of this could have been prevented. None of this should have ever happened. The courtroom was silent as McGranahan finished his testimony because no one could believe this already horrid case could get any worse. Joseph Daniels was ultimately sentenced to 51 years in prison without the possibility of parole. They wanted him locked up for good to never be able to hurt anyone ever again. Crystal Daniels did eventually enter a plea deal of her own. In May of 2022, she pled no contest to the charges of aggravated child neglect. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. No parole, no probation, just time. And her sentence really reflected what so many people felt all along, that even if she never personally laid a hand on baby Joe, she still had failed to protect him. Some people believe that Joseph never fully told the truth, even if he had it. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of guilt, or maybe out of just detachment from reality, while others believed he may truly not remember, like he said several times. And there are even people who believe that he didn't act alone, or maybe he wasn't involved at all, and that his defense was right, that he was forced into this confession. But no matter what theory you hold on to, Joe still isn't here, and all the questions have not been answered. Even now, investigators with the TBI and with Dickson County Sheriff's Office continue to field tips. They re-examine evidence. They search rural areas where Joseph once lived and traveled. They have continued to try to look for this little boy, but they keep coming back with nothing. But even with all this bad, there was still some sliver of good that came out of it. In 2022, Tennessee ended up passing Public Chapter 944, which is now informally known as the Joe Clyde Daniels Act. And it's pretty simple, but it's a pretty powerful, to-the-point concept. If you murder someone and then you refuse to say where the body is, you better believe that counts against you when you're up for parole. Parole boards across the state in Tennessee are now required to weigh obstruction of justice, especially in cases like Baby Joe's, where the victim may still be missing. I honestly think that is one of the best things to come out of this, because if you are going to hide a body and then sit in prison, leaving everyone else in turmoil, be prepared to answer for it forever. I first looked into this case years ago, around when the trial began, and I have looked into it regularly since then with some ounce of hope in me that Baby Joe would be found. And that's half the reason why I've looked into this case. I did this research. I watched the trial years ago and still never posted a video because I just was clinging to this hope that I could have some sort of answer at the end of it, that Baby Joe was found and he was able to be peacefully laid to rest. But unfortunately, that's not happened, and it needs to. And so I hope eventually someone comes to their senses and either remembers what happened to him and where he was put, or decides it's finally time to just come forward and tell the truth. On that note, you guys, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Baby Joe's story. I know it was an incredibly tough one, and I will try to stay away from cases involving children for a little bit. I know it's a lot to handle, but I appreciate it because telling stories like this, getting this information out there, is exactly how people like this are found. It's how cases like this are ultimately solved. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video.